Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to be here with you today, and a challenge as well to be the last speaker of the day. But I hope that we can engage and have a very interesting discussion now. So if I'm just going to put up the first slide, if that's at all possible. So 331 billion US dollars. So that number, 331 billion, that is how much trade we estimate is blocked each year by barriers related to product testing, certification, and lack of accreditation. This is around 2.3% of the value of global trade in any given year. So when countries don't align with international standards, don't cooperate, aren't transparent, and don't use tools like accreditation, this hampers trade and the global economy. And that is why accreditation matters for the World Trade Organization and for international trade. There is an immense opportunity to do better and free up this trade, and this would mean new export and growth opportunities for businesses in Australia and worldwide. And this is why the work of NATA and Australia's quality infrastructure more broadly is so important to make testing standards and accreditation work for Australians and Australian businesses. In today's challenging global trade environment, where we see rising economic and geopolitical tensions, these potential gains are significant, and we at the WTO are determined to work with our member governments and their stakeholders to overcome these and other non-tariff barriers to trade. So in my remarks this afternoon, I will focus on the question of how can the WTO help countries around the world unlock this $331 billion. But before this, I just would like to take a couple minutes to set the scene on what we see from our windows in our office on Lake Geneva in terms of the global outlook for trade and the economy. So like you, we see daily news pronouncing the rise of protectionism, the weakening and sometimes even the end of globalization, and the world trading system. So we hear a whole new vocabulary that's been developed: decoupling, de-risking, reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, and plenty other terms out there to describe this. But I think we have to ask ourselves the question, is globalization really receding? And from where we sit at the WTO, we unequivocally see that neither trade nor globalization is at risk of collapse. So world trade has proven to be quite resilient, including the most recent challenging years. It rebounded well after plunging during the COVID-19 pandemic, as you can of course understand why, and has continued to withstand ongoing conflicts and disruptions around the world. Our projections indicate that global trade volumes will actually increase by 2.5% in 2024 and more than 3% in 2025. And that's after a fall of about 1% last year. And these projections of growth are consistent also with the signals we are getting from our members through trade policy monitoring, which suggests a tendency overall of governments making it easier to trade. So while there have been a number of new trade restricting measures, both on the import and export side, there's also a strong trend of facilitating trade. And when we look at overall, the number of measures that facilitate outweigh the number of restrictions. So I've sort of painted a picture of trade and of one of resilience of trade. But at the same time, we have to admit that there are signs of fragility. Trade growth has been somewhat stagnating since the 2008 financial crisis, and that's measured as the share of the global share of exports to GDP. So this means that basically the trend of trade driving growth has slowed, despite expansion in previous years. We also see a worrying trend of fragmentation. The global economy is appearing to split into at least two different trading blocks, and that's more pronounced since the start of the war in Ukraine, according to our analysis. So while we at the WTO do not see a collapse in global trade, we can identify selected tensions in specific areas of the economy and trade. And these tensions, I would argue, are concentrated around three different areas. So first, geopolitics. The second area is the climate transition, and third is industrial policy. When we look at geopolitical and security concerns, there is definitely a feeling that these are weighing more on trade flows nowadays. Since 2018, for example, there was 30% less growth in bilateral trade between the United States and China, the two biggest economies in the world, as compared to their trade with the rest of the world. So you can see how that rivalry has reduced trade. Our economists have also found a sharp increase in the number of export controls and sanctions being applied, which have tripled between 2016 and 2022. So that's one area of tension. Another is in the climate transition, which is at the root of various emerging trade conflicts, we can say. So a growing number of countries are considering or imposing carbon costs or border adjustments on products, depending on their carbon content. And we are also seeing potential tariff wars and trade defense instruments being used in sectors that are critical for the green economy transition. So, for example, the United States and the European Union announced tariffs on electric vehicles from China in the last few weeks, and China has also reciprocated in kind. Third, industrial policy in general is back in fashion. We see economies at all levels of development using more and more export restrictions on things like critical minerals and rare earths, as well as rising subsidies. And these industry policy tools are often also linked to the green transition. So for the moment, these tensions are concentrated, we can say, in these areas, and they have not yet given rise to a full-blown global trade war. Nevertheless, it's clear that they're adding uncertainty and costs and making it harder for businesses to trade. So we need to closely monitor and manage these tensions to head off the risk of worsening subsidy races or eventual trade wars. The WTO system, I would argue, based on non-discrimination, transparency, and the rule of law is the best defense we have against this type of challenge. And so we need to continue to rely upon that. So coming back to my original question then, so how can the WTO help members to unlock this 331 billion of trade? So maybe not surprisingly, but I think coming from the WTO point of view, the rule book that we have is certainly at the core of the answer. Regulations, standards, conformity assessment procedures like accreditation and testing, these are all instruments used by governments to fulfill their legitimate policy objectives. This can be protecting health, safety, the environment, privacy, or consumer interests. At the same time, if these tools are misused, they can be very effective at protecting domestic industry and blocking trade. So the World Trade Organization, through its Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, TBT for short, sets out ground rules for applying standards and regulations and testing and other procedures in trade. And these are for making sure that there's transparency, non-discrimination, and also harmonization with international standards. And that's something we've heard about since this morning today. So we seek to avoid unnecessary barriers to trade while ensuring the right of our governments to regulate in the public interest. So just before I left for Geneva, I bought this new Lego set for my 6-year-old son. So I'm a big fan of Star Wars and Lego, and I bet I will end up playing with this probably more than him and enjoy it more. But what does this have to do with accreditation and global trade regulation? So as a parent, keeping my son safe is my #1 priority. I can't, personally visit the factory where the Lego pieces are molded or painted. I need to rely on the certification mark on the box and the regulatory controls that are behind this. And I hope and I can trust that this is backed by testing and accreditation. And therefore, that gives me trust in the product and that the pieces won't endanger or harm my son. At the same time, as a consumer, I want to have choice amongst the newest and highest quality products at a good price, of course. So accreditation and recognized testing internationally helps to facilitate this kind of trade and keeps costs down, which is especially important when around the world we're facing a cost of living crisis. Without it, trade can't take place, consumer choice is lower, and we pay more. So accreditation does also really matter for consumers as well. So a government in any country clearly has an important role to play in this equation, in these Star Wars figures. So on the one hand, keeping toys safe and on the other, facilitating trade. And this is what the TBT agreement is all about. It's helping governments to strike this balance between public policy objectives and the risks at hand. Here it's about children's health and safety, but it can be about the environment, privacy, security, and others. So that's the one hand. And then the other hand is facilitating trade, making it easier for businesses to operate across borders. So harmonization with international standards, I mentioned that already, that is one key pillar of the WTO. When countries use the same global benchmark for their local requirements, it makes it much easier to trade across borders, and that brings down costs and leads to efficiency gains. And then accreditation is another key pillar for facilitating trade and public policies. So together with the other parts of the quality infrastructure, standards, metrology, conformity assessment, and accreditation, all of these parts together allow supply chains to function effectively and meet consumer and regulator expectations. The global network of accreditation bodies that you've been hearing about today and heard about in the opening session this morning, working together under the framework of international standards, is an indispensable part of building trust in trade. So the WTO recognizes this important role of accreditation, and by facilitating acceptance of testing and certification, this avoids the duplication and added costs that we get of having to retest, recertify a product in every market in a different way. So this kind of cooperation on accreditation issues, on standards and regulation, is really important also in addressing the biggest global challenges we face today. Whether we're talking about health pandemics like COVID, whether we're talking about climate change, or new digital technologies like AI. If we think back a few years to the fight against COVID, this was hugely boosted actually through accreditation and cooperation on testing and certification of PPE and vaccines. So accreditation bodies work together, and I know NADA was also, of course, working hard in this space, and also to improve and speed up supply, not only of tests, but also medical equipment, and to help economies recover more quickly from the pandemic. And surely our response to future pandemics will also lean on accreditation to allow regulators to work at pace and draw in the expertise of the quality infrastructure bodies. Efforts also to meet the climate change challenge that we're confronted with today are actually being impeded by a proliferation of different approaches to measuring emissions and net zero claims. So there's an uncertainty today in the market and a lack of transparency around this, and it's slowing down decarbonization investments and also creating risks of greenwashing. So there's growing demand globally for an internationally agreed methodologies that are backed by verification and ultimately accreditation as well. So for instance, as Australia's mining and metal sector tackles the green steel challenge, trusted testing and measurement will be essential to demonstrate the carbon credentials, say, of green iron and pass these emission savings on to buyers in the steel value chain. Accreditation also plays an essential role in harnessing the power of fast-moving digital technologies like artificial intelligence, while also mitigating their risks. If we think about digitally connected products with AI, think about a self-driving car and autonomous vehicle, for example. These will evolve new features and actually be customized by consumers after their original approval by regulators. So this may entail new risks and new challenges. So keeping people safe and protecting digital security and privacy in respect of these frontier digital technologies. This is a huge challenge that accreditation and testing will need to confront. So clearly the importance of accreditation in all of these global challenges is not going away. In 2024, so far this year, WTO members as well, so all of our 164 member governments, including, of course, Australia, are putting ever greater priority and political focus on this area of regulation, standards, and accreditation. And there were 3 important developments this year that mark a deepening of efforts to cooperate on accreditation and standards. So first, in February this year, at our 13th ministerial conference in Abu Dhabi, so that's the top decision-making body of the WTO, all of the WTO trade ministers agreed on a multilateral declaration on regulatory cooperation and technical barriers to trade. And this recognized at the highest political level the need for stronger cooperation on standards, regulations, and accreditation to help facilitate trade. more broadly. Then in March this year as well, WTO members adopted new guidelines, new technical guidelines on actually conformity assessment procedures and accreditation. And these are an important reference for governments and also clarify the value of accreditation to facilitate international trade. They point to the ILAC and IAF system as the global network, and also the ISO Cascal toolbox as important reference points. Another important development this year is that members are reviewing the operation of this agreement on technical barriers to trade, and there are a large number of proposals on the table touching on issues around accreditation, including one, for example, from Australia on interoperable data standards, amongst others. And so that's another important area and focus, which shows that this work is really gaining international importance at the global level. So all of these efforts will help to strengthen the role of the WTO in promoting transparency and managing trade frictions. Oops. I see. So under WTO rules, so in this area of transparency and managing trade frictions, the WTO rules require actually all of our governments to notify draft regulations to all other governments and actually to undergo a global public consultation whenever a new trade restricting regulation is put into place. And this takes place through our online transparency tool, which is called EPING, which you see on the screen in front of you. So I encourage you to just Google EPING and check it out and sign up. And it's a place where you can find out more and follow along with this work that all of our governments are doing. Then when the trade frictions do flare up, which they inevitably do, that's where the WTO meetings and coming to Geneva is very important. So for example, at the last meeting we had earlier this month, Australia raised a number of concerns, for example, with Indonesia's halal assurance law, the European Union's new regulation on deforestation, or China's rules on imported foods or medical devices. So these conversations help to find technical solutions that allow trade to keep flowing. One thing I wanted to highlight, which I think is notable, is that Australia consistently punches above its weight in this work at the WTO. So the Australian Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade, which represents Australia, does a very good job of drawing in the technical infrastructure and the experts like NADA and the other QI bodies to shape Australia's position. And thus, this expert engagement helps to make Australia's positioning stronger and more able to influence international discussions. So, ladies and gentlemen, the global economy, I think we can say, is really at an inflection point. The risk of fragmentation and trade wars looms over our heads. And in this challenging environment, the answer I think we have to think about, the answer to this challenge is not to shy away from the multilateral system, as there sometimes is a tendency to do, but actually lean in and refocus on the multilateral solutions. So as my boss, Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala says, the best response to the problems we see today is not a deglobalization, but actually a reglobalization. And reglobalization is about deepening, diversifying, and deconcentrating supply chains to make trade more inclusive. So the idea here is to actually bring in those people and places and those workers that are on the fringes of the global economy who didn't benefit from the first round of globalization that we had in the early 2000s. So making that happen is all about reglobalization. And I would argue that actually accreditation is a vital piece of this reglobalization puzzle by building confidence in trade through standards, through accreditation, through the quality infrastructure. And this really needs to be in the toolbox of every government as they seek to make trade work better for their citizens and economies. So how to unlock the $331 billion of global trade? So we can leverage the WTO rulebook to promote greater use of international standards, accreditation, and trust in trade. We can proactively address the intersection with emerging global challenges, whether they be climate or digital issues, and draw upon accreditation in regulatory solutions. And we can also cooperate through the WTO and other frameworks to enhance transparency and solve trade issues, to make it easier for businesses to grow in Australia and worldwide. Finding solutions to trade frictions from accreditation and certification would be a huge benefit to the global economy, And NATA's work, together with other partners in Australia, is crucial for these efforts, and we very much look forward to working with you. So accreditation matters deeply for a robust and resilient global trade and for our shared economic and societal prosperity. Thank you very much.
First one is, how do you see the impact of Russia and other geopolitically disturbed countries making it hard for the WTO to deal with such situations?
No, thank you, Steve, for the question. So I think there are a number of geopolitical challenges and conflicts that we see in the world today. We are all following these, and these can create different challenges for trade. Whether it's about new types of restrictions that are being applied to respond, I mentioned sanctions before, or it's about disruption of existing trade routes and patterns, whether we're talking about trade in grain or trade through the Suez Canal. So there are many different examples. So I think one message that I want to highlight again is the resiliency of trade. Despite these challenges, we see that trade growth is still expected to expand this year. And of course, the cooperation that we benefit from with all of our members, including Australia and the WTO, helps to make this happen.
A question from George Vorobiev. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. The question is, if the European CE mark is legally valid in Europe and not in Australia, how can we be confident that we're getting conforming products since the importer has only 1 year warranty as a legal requirement?
So I think I followed mostly, but maybe I'll make it's a very important question and certainly one that we've heard before about the use of different marks and lack of recognition between different certification marks. So I think one challenge is that, of course, there are different approaches to conformity assessment and the modules used behind those marks in different countries. And that leads to different levels of confidence and differences between countries as well in terms of how they see risks in products, also leads to different treatment of products within these types of frameworks. So that's a continuous challenge and something that is being worked on and discussed in the WTO.
From Anonymous, what is the major commodity, for example, chips, minerals, hydrocarbons, that make up the large part of the in US dollars, that $331 billion that you've referred to? And in the WTO's view, how much of that can be recovered through accreditation?
So I don't have the breakdown of the products here on the slide because this is forthcoming analysis that we're going to come out with in the next month. But I can tell you that a lot of it is petrochemicals and mineral products. So that's maybe one area, but it's also machinery and many other products. So it's true that in some sectors, probably the solutions are easier, more readily found through accreditation. But also I would say that figure is probably a gross underestimation in the sense that this is only those issues that we hear about that are being discussed in the WTO. So of course there are many other issues that don't come to our attention, which of course are related to this challenge. So I think it's a sort of a call to action to say that there's a lot of potential to do more, to cooperate more on accreditation and conformity assessment.
How genuine are countries in seeking better global trade links?
So I think today, of course, there's a lot of discussion in in countries around the world around the challenges posed by trade. So it's also a political issue in many countries because, of course, it's about jobs. Trade opening can create winners and losers, and that's always going to be a challenge. So I think the important thing is making sure that the overall benefits are better distributed more equally amongst societies across different sectors, and that's one of the challenges that we have. But I think countries in the WTO are, I would say, all working in good faith to try to make progress in many different areas, whether we're talking about electronic commerce, curbing harmful fishery subsidies, or investment facilitation. So there's a lot of work going on and a lot of different interests coming together behind that. It's just a question of how to get consensus with 164. And I guess those of you who are involved in setting standards know the challenge of reaching reaching consensus.
From David Harris, David asks, how susceptible is the accreditation community to being undermined by populist leaders for political purposes?
Well, I think the way that I would think about this is that the way that we talk about this as well is that one of the strengths of accreditation and the technical and quality infrastructure, the international standardization system that we have, is its apolitical nature. So this is about technical issues, a technical solution to a challenge, and experts coming together and taking off their national hats and really working and getting down to business to get a solution that works for everyone. So I think that, but we can't discount the risk that more, as tensions grow, maybe this will also creep into this work. But I think for now, what we see is that despite all these challenges, these systems continue to work, and there's still hope there that technical aspect can be the focus.
A question from one of our panelists from an earlier segment, Karine Riley-Takos. How do you see the multilateral system surviving and or striving, given its lack of agility to deal with critical and emerging technologies?
Yeah, so that's a very important question, and I think one that our members in the WTO are also grappling with. So in my remarks, I mentioned the fact that there's an ongoing review of the TBT agreement, and one of the topics in that review process is, should the WTO and WTO members have more discussion around critical and emerging technologies in a way to follow more closely the international standardization in these technologies, given that there are indeed challenges sometimes of pacing and technological development. So what role will that play? So I think certainly there's a need here for bringing in both the public and private cooperation to deal with the public-private sort of partnership approach to deal with those challenges. But I think it's something that our governments are talking about.
From Anonymous, what is an example of a global regulatory solution?
Well, I think it really depends on the sector that you're talking about. But certainly, if you look at the WTO system as a whole, I mean, we are not a global regulator as such, or a global sectoral regulator at all. It's a framework and a baseline that provides guidance for regulation of all sectors. Then, of course, you have the international standards that are drawn in. Now, what you see outside of the WTO is that some countries will come up with free trade or bilateral or regional trade agreements. So these are sort of deeper types of agreements. And in those contexts, they may have specific sort of regulatory agreements for whether it's cars, cosmetics, anything, medical devices, a range of products. And in those, it's important to say that in there you see there's a lot of emphasis on accreditation, on conformity assessment and cooperation, because this is where there is space actually to come together and facilitate trade.
You talk about, this is another anonymous question. You talk about the WTO rulebook. How urgent is the need to review it? And which country or countries are obstructing better free global trade? And how can accreditation help that?
It's a huge question. I think
it's actually a three-parter.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think so first of all, to give a bit of context for those of you that might not know, so the WTO was created in 1994-95. And its rules actually date from 1947 to a sort of post-war institution that was created at that time called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So we actually have a long history, these rules. And if you look at what the agreements that we have, okay, they're negotiated in the early 90s. So the question is, are they fit for purpose today? What we have is that we have, over these years, adopted new agreements on trade facilitation. So that's it, smoothing things at the border, a single windows, making customs procedures faster. I mentioned just earlier a new agreement we recently reached on fisheries subsidies, so curbing harmful fisheries subsidies. And there are other areas. But given the environment we're in today and the number of challenges we face, there are calls to say, okay, well, we need to reform, we need to work more on reviewing the WTO rulebook. And I think that's a question that our members have to grapple with and see how best to address it.
Okay, from Bruce. How does the WTO work with other international organisations governing parts of quality infrastructure, such as ILAC?
We work, a number of organizations have an observer status in the WTO, like ISO and IEC and a few others as well. And then we also are engaging in the work of different QI institutions. So we cooperate, I think, in the area of both capacity building and also sort of policy coherence and discussion. So we work with the networks of quality infrastructure bodies and engaging in different capacities, sometimes in country-specific projects or in broader global discussions.
Okay, last question from Steve. Coincidental? No, I'm being smart. My last question. To what extent is politics an impediment to better trade and public policy? And look into your crystal ball and tell me where you expect your next big problem to come from.
I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, so that's a bit tricky to do. But I think, as we're all aware, there's a lot of there's a number of political changes in important markets. So elections happening this year. There are just recently the European elections. We have the elections coming up in the United States, and we have a lot of political change, sea change in many countries, and that, of course, can create new policy-making environments. And so, of course, we don't know how that will go. I think looking ahead, I mean, the future of trade is going to continue to be more on green, on digital, and on services. So those are key areas of trade, the future of trade. And I think the greening of trade is going to continue. And more and more work will be in the area of AI and digital and how those issues are going to be dealt with in the rulebook of the WTO.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank Devin McDaniel.